Hello and welcome to BW TV. Welcome to another episode of BW Marketing World's new interview series in partnership with Kaizen. BW Marcom Power Talks, conversations that drive the next big moves. This is the series where I talk to corporate communication and marketing captains about the latest trends, the changing role of communication leaders, new gen strategy, and a lot more. In a world where a single tweet or a post can make or break reputations, the role of corporate communications has never been more critical. Uh, Many incidents, where the rapid spread of misinformation or public backlash over controversial advertising campaigns by major brands, highlighting the immense responsibility of corporate communication leaders shoulder in managing narratives and protecting brand trust. With India's digital user base crossing over 1,000 million, an increasingly vigilant audience demanding transparency, corporate communications teams must stay ahead of the curve. And for that matter, with this context, in today's conversation, we kind of try to delve deeper into these pressing themes, exploring how corporate communications can adapt to the evolving landscape while setting the benchmark for excellence. For today's conversation, I am joined by Minari Shah, who is the brand and communications consultant. Welcome, Ms. Shah.
Good to be here. Thank you for inviting me to the station.
Interesting. Just to start the conversation, I'm intrigued, being a Gen Z or being an avid user of social media, I'm intrigued by the abundance of information. We can also say there's an abundance of misinformation, fake news. This is becoming pervasive. How can corporate communication teams or leaders such as you actively protect and kind of strengthen a company's reputation? What is your take on this, Mishra?
There are a few different aspects that one needs to think about. One is, when the kind of situation where, let's say, someone from a leadership team or an employee just puts something which should not be out there on social media. Right? So that's one kind of an issue with social media. And that to me is not very different from in the past, where one had to be very thoughtful and careful about what one says. One can't just randomly speak. The only difference is it's now like taking a loudspeaker in hand and broadcasting it across the world. So earlier it could have been in a room. Now you're literally going global if you go wrong and say something, and it travels really fast. So it's real time. The response needs to be faster. So that's the one issue. And for that, really the old fashioned thing about ensuring that, you have thoughtfulness, you have planned, like what exactly, how do you want your organization to be represented or leaders to be represented, that thoughtfulness. The other part of the issue is what you represented as the misinformation part of it. I think good companies are now recognizing that reputation is one of the most important factors in business today. So this really means both proactive reputation management, so ensuring that your customers or investors or partners and employees, stakeholders are all having the right understanding of your organization. This means that it's an ongoing journey, because then when there is one anecdote or one instance of, a fake news or misinformation, interestingly, in some of my past experiences, I've seen that customers or, advocates actually jump in directly to protect and defend the company. And that's really the most organic and the best kind of defense. But that only happens if you have an ongoing good reputational journey where there are already people who are in favor of you, your customers or your partners or your employees, and they actually jump in. So that's one part of it. However, of course, you need a very, very strong reactive reputation management against fake news, etc. One is, of course, real-time tools in terms of, analytics and tools for real-time listening and monitoring and information and so on. But equally important is that there must be a playbook. Sometimes there are recurring kinds of customer issues or, things which one has seen come up a few repeated times. So what should be the approval mechanisms? Who is the right leadership to be involved? How can you have holding statements that are ready and quickly tweaked and approved? So how can you kind of have a ready playbook for some crisis? On the other hand, there are some crises which are unexpected and one is kind of just ambushed suddenly. It came out of nowhere, out of the left field. One did not see it coming. In such cases, also the playbook helps. Are you very, very connected? Like, do you know who are the five people in the company that you must go to from a legal or a regulatory or a business leadership, CEO or HR leader or legal leader? Like those relationships, those mechanisms, and those leaders know that when you call, they have to pick up that call. When there is an email marked urgent, they prioritize that. That playbook is critically important. And then I think it's the responsibility of the corporate communications person to align these, bring these together fast, and really pull together a quick response. The one final piece I always tell people is this response must be thoughtful and fast. Sometimes people rush out with a fast response, and that could make the situation worse. So be sure that you've thought it through. Take 10 extra minutes, half an hour extra, but make sure you're getting it right.
Interesting. These are some of the things that been traditionally practiced over the years, right? But if I kind of push you to tell us what has changed in the last 2 to 3 years, or let's say 5 years span, there are many things that has transformed drastically, and so are the ways of leaders dealing with different kinds of crisis. Tell me what in this playbook has changed.
A few things. Like I said, one, the pressure to be real time, right? It's a real thing. One, the trolling or the negative responses are building up really fast. And therefore, kind of balancing that, do I have all the right information? The corporate communications leaders have the responsibility to get their ground facts right. When a situation happened, was the company at fault? Did the company have a role to play? Is it a kind of a, should we be transparently saying a me culpa and saying, okay, we went wrong? Or is it a misinformation and fake news? So get your facts right. So taking the time out to do that, making sure there is alignment. So all of those things take time, but you have to do it fast. So that speed of response is one of the big changes that have come in. The other big change that has come in is too many people, from the business leaders to the employees, can now just go on one or the other social platform and put out their view. Earlier, the corporate communications person had the time because they were responding to the media. And most likely, the media person was only calling one or two or five people. Now there are literally hundreds of thousands or 10,000s of employees, or the business leaders themselves get so agitated sometimes that they feel a need to quickly respond to their LinkedIn or their Twitter or some such handle. And kind of teaching and training people way before a crisis happens that you cannot do that. You still need to align, you still need to follow those processes as imperative. And that, I think, is the other big change that's happened. And the third change, therefore, that's happened is for a lot of situations, given we lived in a very fragmented, even polarized, highly opinionated world, where there are invariably two very strong fields of opinion on almost every issue, you're sometimes damned if you do and damned if you don't. You go one side or other, there's one group that is waiting to, get you. So how do you balance that? When do you speak? How much do you speak? How do you calibrate that? I think that's the other big change. There is no, this is the right message anymore on almost any topic. Almost any topic, one would have thought, you've seen the big political issues, the wars, the Gaza issue. No one knows what's the right side, right? Because you could get damned either way. You know, um, you are seeing in US this huge situation vis-a-vis DEI. There's a group which is saying it's too woke. We're removing our DEI, diversity principles. Meta has removed its fact-checking mechanisms. So there are all these big developments. So it's, how do you stay relevant and on top of these fast-changing worlds while making sure that you mitigate and reduce the risk to the level you can?
Very well put, Ms. Shah. I can relate to it, to the most of it, I would say. Now, to the next step of our conversation is I want to understand how the role of the communication leader is changing. I mean, dealing with Gen Z set of workforce, the newer set of crisis, the newer strategy of building or building or strengthening a brand's reputation. What are some of the changes in a role of a communication leader? How has it changed?
In some ways, I think it's so. I think the problem that exists in real life is that different companies have different perceptions of what a corporate communications person should do. So, whatever that I'm saying are the things that good, robust organizations that recognize how important reputation is. So, I'm basing it on that. For example, it starts as simple as, does the corporate communications or the comms person have a seat at the leadership table? That's been an evolving journey. It
Very
cannot
important.
be reporting into the marketing team. It has to report to the CEO,
Correct. Very
right?
important. My apologies, I'm interjecting, but I strongly agree with you, and this sounds really, really relevant because I'm seeing a lot more coherence, or let's say a lot more push for merging these two, three teams, let's say marketing, communications, and PRs within a company. And this is happening a lot more in the smaller organizations, which small scale organizations. There may be many factors and reasons behind it, but this is one area which needs a lot of conversation. How important is the role? Where it needs a seat? As you rightly mentioned, this role is of a paramount importance, and this directly needs to convey to the top boss. Very rightly said.
So, yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest ones. And interestingly, there are two trends. As you said, there are companies that seem to be converging and bringing these together. And then there are the really companies that recognize how important reputation and perception management is, how real it is, how it could be mid-sized, it could be small founding organizations, or it could be really large organizations. Like I've been super lucky to work with companies that really always recognize this and never ever change the fact that you worked with the CXOs, the CEOs, or the managing directors, or company leadership. You reported indirectly there. It always had a seat at the leadership table. Absolutely always, without fail. And that's been my thing for last, I don't know, 20 years. Um, so to me, I think it's critically important, and I strongly urge communications leaders when headhunters call. I have done this in the past for roles that report into marketing. I said I'm not willing to discuss for some very big brand names. I said I'm not willing to have that conversation. I'm sorry, I do not work, because that's, I think, a very critical issue. So that makes a difference. Two, I think communications people need to understand very deeply not just how a business is run, but there are evolving changes in policy. Policy interventions have become more real across the world everywhere than ever. Policy dynamics, regulatory issues, geopolitics, US and China, Middle East policies, Ukraine war and support. These are mega issues. These are impacting companies. These are going to impact not just how companies, even if you're looking to stay within a country, these are going to impact supply chains. These are going to impact, are you going to be able to import or export across different markets? These are going to impact, are you going to be able to put people or hire people from different places? It's impacting everything. And all of these would need the companies to have visible, invisible, some notion. And the communications people need to be on top of the geopolitics. They need to understand policy interventions. Um, Governments across the world feel a need to intervene, and rightly so, with new technologies. There are so many technologies, and how is it impacting security? How is it impacting privacy? These are huge issues. And therefore, it's critical that communications people understand these very well. It's equally important, there are new rules across the disclosures for governance or sustainability. The whole ESG place in Europe, for example, those are becoming extremely critical in terms of ESG disclosures. That would include things like, for example, your supply chain sustainability practices. So you can't say, oh, it's not my problem. Your partners and their partners and their partners, what kind of are they, US has banned certain companies because they said that, okay, is there child labor involved in certain imports from certain parts of China? So it's very complex. And that's what makes this job complex, but fantastic and challenging. But that's why,
Interesting.
But that's really why you have to be a part. And these are exactly the kind of things that the CEOs, the CFOs, the CXOs, the leadership team has to make decisions on. And that's why it's critical that a communications person is a part of that decision making, has early visibility, and is able to guide and input in terms of, so one part of the reputation management is when there is a crisis, but the biggest part is really anticipating and being
Wait,
able to
correct.
offer guidance.
Correct, correct. I mean, I see a coherence between how are we thinking, the line of thinking. Now you briefly mentioned about the new technologies. I would like to bring that in. Uh, we're seeing a lot more use of artificial intelligence. We have a lot of apps coming in. These are have to kind of enhance our efficiencies across the borders. This is irrespective of roles. But how do you evaluate its impact on communications, so to say, as a department, as a function? How do you evaluate its long-term impact? We might not be seeing its long-term impact now, but you, as a leader who holds immense experience, how do you evaluate its long-term impact?
I think these are such early days and it's such a fast evolving technology, that frankly, what we've seen in the last 12, 15 months is maybe the tip of the iceberg. So I don't think we have enough knowledge yet. In these very early times, what we can say is yes, it's definitely helping us do certain things better. It's certainly helping things where automation people are using this for monitoring. People are using this for like creating first drafts. People are using this for first drafts of all kinds, from social posts, articles, designs, all kinds of first drafts, briefing books for leadership. It's interesting that there are, AI tools that can even get your tonality. You can tell them what tonality do you want, and so on. So there is a whole bunch of things being done around that. AI is, beginning to kind of play up in measurement and, all of that. I think the key things to remember is, and I've said this in some platforms before, I think people need to play with these tools a lot more. Stop talking about it, experiment with it, play with it, have fun. Unless you're hands-on with these tools, you're not going to, first of all, know what works and what doesn't. Two, remember that most of these tools, when you put prompts, when you put things, you're putting things in a public domain. People do not always realize, if I'm going to be putting up a prompt, I need to realize that's going in a public domain. And therefore, I need to be very careful about using my company information about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. And that's something that people need to be trained for and understand. I think companies, especially some of the large tech companies that I have known, are beginning to make decisions about what tools are they comfortable with, what parts can they use or not use. The larger companies are developing their own in-house AI tools for many things rather than, leaning into these. So I think there are a lot of advantages, but there needs to be a lot of guardrails and a lot of care. But yeah, it would be foolish to not play with these tools. And I mean, translations for, global, or even in a country like India with so many languages. But it's so early in the stage of these that you better be reading these. The final part is disclosures. If you're using an AI tool to even create early drafts, it's important to do fact checking, because AI is not necessarily correct. Something that you get on an AI tool. So are you fact checking? Are you doing rigorous corroborating to know that you've got things right? Are you doing the right disclosures to say an AI tool was used for an early draft of this article or some such thing? So I think those are important.
Very well said. And now, turning this conversation towards your most loved area of work, that's strategy. I mean, in today's time, given that you have worked with the top names of the world across the sectors, now, given that today we see a lot more short-term pressure. Uh, I mean, it was never different earlier also, but in today's time, it's a lot more comparatively. What would be your advice in terms of strategy making, in terms of influencing the top decision makers to how kind of strategize to handle the short-term pressure for the long-term business growth? How are you kind of overseeing it, or how would you kind of intervene and suggest a business approach, or let's say a communications approach to kind of navigate for a long term business growth?
I think what I've always believed in, one of the things I learned at one of my previous companies, which I've loved deeply, is strategy is something that you don't change very fast. Strategy has to remain consistent over a period of time. In communications lingo, a company is not going to stand for different things every quarter or every month or even every year, right? There could be some nuances that would change with changing landscape. But what a company means, if I worked with Amazon, which said we want to be the most customer obsessed company in the world, they're not going to say, oh, we don't want that. That remains their vision. So I think it's critically important that communications leaders know what their strategy is and build a long-term strategy. The piece that people often don't get right is they think of strategy and crisis as two different things. But your proactive long term strategy needs to build in potential crisis. Are there going to be policy interventions? Are there going to be new disclosures? Are there going to be new technology issues? Companies have said, okay, AI tools or face reading devices, biometrics, how are these devices going to impact security and cybersecurity and privacy? So putting this into your proactive strategic plan, are you going to need these? Are you a company that's dealing with these pieces, or are you dealing with, overlapping partners or policies which are dealing with these? How is that built in? So planning all of that, what are the areas? So putting this together is critical well in advance. And therefore building a long-term strategy in terms of like, okay, this is how we want to be perceived. That's part one. Two is, how are you kind of reviewing and tactically checking these both for implementation? Because, yeah, a lot of times you could have grand plans, but how are you? One of the things I see getting derailed is people have these wonderful plans, for 12 months or 18 months or whatever. And then that gets put in some closet and or a computer folder. And then what people are doing is responding ad hoc to the day-to-day asks and so one business leader says, oh, I want to issue this announcement. Someone else says, oh, we're launching that product. Someone else says, oh, we have this customer related issue, and so on and so forth. And before you know, there are a whole bunch of things which have nothing to do with the plan that you put in place. So what's really critical is, what are your review mechanisms? What are your buy-ins from leadership? And the most therefore important thing is prioritization. How are you going to prioritize? Is that really needed? And therefore, comms teams, not just the comms leaders, comms teams need to be empowered. And the comms leaders' job is to help the teams be empowered to go back to the business leaders or teams and say, this is not needed. This is not going to help. More is not always better. Sometimes less and impactful is what you need. I have a term which I say vanity coverage. Just doing things because you're going to be seen, which is not adding any value, or those tiny little things, in some corner of even a big news, Economic Times, but like page 14, 4 lines, no one's reading that. It's only going in your coverage report. Nobody cares about that. It's moving no perception needle. So stop doing vanity coverage. Stop doing activities that don't. And then looking at your channel strategy holistically. Do I need to be on social media? Do I need to be on owned channels? Do I need to be on media, earned media? Do I need to do events? Do I need to create flagship properties, whether virtual, whether real life? What is that whole strategy looking like, which is taking a holistic picture? And then by and large, 75, 80% sticking to that. There will be occasional things. There could be policy things that come up. There would be crises that would come up. There would be leadership changes that would come up. There would be new businesses or products that would come up, which would change business pivots. So you would obviously need to respond to that. But most times, I would say that's 20 to 30%. So keep that buffer. But which means that in my head, when you're planning your strategy, it can't be overfull. Make it a strategy which knows that about 30, 35% of my time, I would need to pivot into other things. But the rest has to be on this.
Great, Mr. Now we're in the fresh year. We're in the first month speaking. What are some of the trends? What are some of the newer practices you foreseeing right now? When you look at the newer comms team people who are closely working with the comms leads, what are some of the practices that you were seeing that will take over largely? What are some of the major trends you are seeing?
So I'm seeing some and I'm not seeing some, but what I believe should be important. One, like we already discussed, companies need to recognize how critical reputation is and how it's at the heart of the strategy. One single thing, it could be an employee issue, it could be a internal issue, it could be a finance issue or debt, anything can, throw a company out of the gear and impact its business. So one is that. The second piece is really recognizing that communications needs a holistic channel strategy. It's not just about media relations. And recognizing that these need to be woven and integrated together. How and when are you going to use social media? How and when are you going to use owned channels? How and when are you going to even use paid influencer marketing? How and when are you going to use, earned media? So this whole gamut of influencer marketing, which is largely paid, social media, which is often got its paid elements quite significantly, owned channels and earned media need to work into a coherent whole. Even and one component which people don't tend to pay enough attention to is internal communications. It kind of becomes like, just a information passing tool. But if you've seen some of the biggest issues, especially on the Western Hemisphere, have come from employee activism, whether it's around gender, whether it's around race, whether it's around sustainability, whether it's around how AI is being used. There has been a very strong employee activism. So I think that is a trend which is there in parts in companies that recognize it, but it's not necessarily recognized enough. There is an over-indexing. The third thing which needs to get stronger is measurement and tangible impact on business. There has been too much of PR cannot be measured, or very obsolete, old-fashioned things like add value. It was gone even before I started working. It should have been gone. Or even things like, sure, one needs to look at how much coverage one got and so on, but it needs to be quality, quantity together. So I think it's very critical that there is a key measurement impact. Right now we're looking at tactical things, how many clips, how many impressions, about engagement, but what does it all mean is something that, we don't take it to the next step. So connecting that to the business impact, I think, is critically important. And then continuation of that is you need a longer term perception measurement. So for example, on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, you review what are the results that you've got in terms of coverage or followers or impressions or, page views or whatever. What does it mean in terms of the perception management? So do you have, let's say, an annual survey or a poll of your key stakeholders? It could be customers, it could be policymakers, it could be partners, whoever you think are the right ones. How are they? And do you have key areas? These are the areas where we need to score this much. And can communications by itself drive it? Of course not. If a company has terrible customer service, communications can do everything perfectly well. It will not help. If a company has a terrible product, um, you know, everything can go well, but if the product is not performing, it's not going to help. But these surveys will help the communications leaders to go back to the business with tangible data to say these are the business problems that need solving. It's time business leaders realized that communications are not, it's not a magic wand. It's not spin. I detest that word. It's not spin. You're not going to be able to wave a magic wand and change perception. The business needs to be as involved. So the survey will give you a ground reality of what the real perception is. And that is when you start adding value and showing the business leadership how they, and yes, you can then therefore lean into your strategy to say these are the areas where we're performing well. We need to keep it robust and well done. We can't let it drop because these are important. And these are the areas that are important to us where we're not performing well. And either business needs to change something, the communication needs to match up, and how do you really plan for it? So that's the other big piece in terms of measurement and impact. I would think those are the big pieces, the channel strategy, the impact, and really being very, very prioritized. And
So it needs all stakeholders together, not only communications,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
also, I mean, the way you explain all of this, I think viewers who must be watching you must thank you for kind of giving away this strategy. Now, just the final bit of this conversation, we are seeing a lot many newer people coming into the workforce. It's a set rule, but I'm also seeing a lot new people joining PR. It's an interesting job role, as you rightly mentioned. What would be your one piece of advice that people should 100% follow or practice?
I've often said there are two or three things. One, of course, is the domain and the functional skills. You need to be really good, and you can't just be good at the limited aspect of your company, your client, your function. You will not, based on everything else I said, you will not make a good communications or a PR person unless you have a very well-rounded knowledge, which means reading a lot. I'm tired of people who come and tell me we don't have the time. In my last 25 plus years of working, when I was a rookie to now, when I'm, so many years in the business, I have never said I don't have the time to read. Not when I was not the boss, not when I was the boss, never. So you have to be able to read, and you have to read various things. I think it's critical. You need to have functional skills across board, which means you need to be yourself on the social media platforms. You need to be playing with AI. You need to be, doing pitches. So there is hygiene. You need to be able to pitch. You need to be able to build the narratives. Those are hygiene skills. But these things are important. You need to be hands-on involved with all of these pieces. You need to have the ability to speak up. You cannot be tactical and just follow at a young age. You need to experiment. One of the things I love about Amazon was that it strongly believes that if you're not failing enough, you're not experimenting enough. I love that concept, that you need to take risks, but you need to also have the leadership and the ability to judge where can you take a risk and where can you not take a risk. Having that judgment, I think, is critically important. So these, I think, are some of the functional areas which I think are very important. The other piece, which I think is very important, is to kind of be forward looking. I have a son who will turn 18 in another few months. I talk to him a lot about where is he getting information from. And like their sources of information are very different from the traditional sources. It's not even social media. Their social chat platforms are very different. Or the way they use the social platforms, the way he uses Instagram is very different from how I would use Instagram. So how are they getting information? Because these are going to be people who will be talking to as employees and as decision makers and customers, or they already are, right? So I think having a long-term view, having a visibility, how are the politics changing? How are the policies around ESG changing? So have that forward-looking view, I think, is critically important. And the third thing, don't let work absorb you. You have to have things you love to do outside of work, and you have to make time for it. For me, what it meant is, because I have my things I love doing. I love cinema. I love writing. I love spending time with friends and family. I love music. I know it's necessary to exercise. I don't love it, but I know it's critical for me to do. And I have to make time for most of these. I can't make time for all of these all the time, but I can make enough time for these as may be needed. And that's why when I'm super prioritized at my work and not doing things which are not needed, or just blindly saying a yes, or doing vanity coverage, that's where I can get my time from. So being that super prioritized will, one, make you impactful at work, but two, it will also give you a life you to enjoy.
Very helpful sense, Miss Shah. This has been a really insightful conversation. I must thank you for making time for this, and I'm looking forward for more such conversations, a lot more. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Resham. I enjoyed talking to you
Bye
today.
bye. Thank you. Take care. Take care.